It never ceases to amaze me just how many awesome creatures fall through the cracks in Dungeons & Dragons. You would think that it'd be nearly impossible for a species of giants to go missing on account of the fact that they're, well, giants, right? But despite that, even with books entirely dedicated to their kind in 5th edition, there are still a bunch of giants from older versions of D&D that have yet to make the crossing from 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th edition into 5e. Fortunately for them, deep diving into obscure lore nobody's looked at in 3 decades and updating creatures with stat blocks and art is what I do, and today we're taking a trip to the desert and we're gonna find us a giant with some of the coolest lore I've seen for a giant species in a hot minute. Anytime there is a desert-themed monster in D&D, usually it's got roots in either Dark Sun or Al-Qadim, sometimes both, and today's creature, the desert giant, traces its roots back to the AD&D 2nd edition Monstrous Compendium, Al-Qadim Appendix, published in 1992. Regular viewers here will know what these compendiums are all about, and like all the others, this one is a collection of monsters from various Al-Qadim adventures and supplements put out in years previous, all rolled into one convenient book with a few new additions. And on page 36, not that the pages in this book are even numbered, is where we find today's subject. Desert giants stand roughly 17 feet tall, which puts them right between hill and stone giants in terms of size, and as their name would suggest, they tend to live in deserts. They can also be found in plains and regions that border deserts, but the dunes are their true home. They appear as most giants do, humanoid but big, however they've got a couple of specific features that mark them as desert giants and not just hill giants with a tan. Living in the desert, their skin is of course a darker tone, and their eyes are a piercing blue, which I can't help but feel is some kind of Dune reference, but who knows, something the spice must flow. They tend to dress in flowing garments that are not only breathable but also quite colorful as a form of cultural expression, and their culture is a nomadic and mercantile one. Desert giants are usually found in small groups accompanied by enormous herds of sheep or cattle. These massive herds are both their sustenance and their livelihood. Desert giants lead their herds from place to place, following what little rain the desert gets to ensure that their herd is always headed towards greener pastures, stopping for a few days, letting their herd graze before guiding the animals to the next patch of grass. They often stop in cities and settlements they come across on their journeys to trade livestock for whatever supplies they may need. Such visits are always welcome from desert communities, as livestock aren't always easy to come by, and the things that the giants typically want are things that they have a much easier time procuring. One of the most common things these giants will trade for is metal tools. Desert giants don't typically have regular access to a blacksmith or the materials to create anything forged, so they will happily trade with some of their cows and sheep for a giant set of scimitars, spearheads, or even armor. Obviously, making a giant-sized piece of equipment is no small task, but some settlements that regularly see desert giants have forges and blacksmiths who specialize in crafting giant-sized goods specifically to cater to desert giant merchants who pass through. Aside from livestock and tools, desert giants also engage in the trade of fabrics, spices, and just about any other common good that they might be able to sell in another city for a profit. But not everyone is so stoked on the presence of desert giants near their borders. Desert giant herds can be truly massive, which means that they consume a massive amount of food. Some places, especially larger and more established kingdoms that might be hoping to use lush and fertile land within their borders to grow food and harvest crops, don't want a bunch of giants and their herd of 1,000 cows coming through and ravaging the landscape. The giants, however, view this as a whole lot of not their problem. They decidedly think that borders and kingdoms are kinda bullshit, and they believe that the only real laws are the ones you can actually enforce, so when a bunch of humans come threatening them with toothpicks and telling them not to trespass, their reaction is predictable. And while their overgrazing herds might be a nuisance, it's not as bad as having to fight a bunch of angry giants, so they usually get their way. However, richer kingdoms who can afford to bribe the giants will often do so more or less just paying the giants in treasure and tools to stay away from their lands, at least until the following season. To the giants, this is a great deal. They can just come by every season to collect a pile of treasure and then take off to bring their herd elsewhere, assuming there is somewhere else they could go. The other great thing about desert giants is that every single one of them is cursed. I mean, it's not great for them, but for a dungeon master, the Desert Giant Curse is a great bit of world building and maybe even a cool plot device. The book is unclear about precisely what happened to them, but the story goes that in the ancient past, desert giants weren't nomadic. In fact, they had their own kingdom. But they were stricken with what the book calls a divine curse, implying that the curse was laid upon them by a deity of some kind, or maybe the followers of a deity. The curse is slow and insidious. Over the course of a desert giant's life, they are gradually petrified, until eventually they completely turn to stone. Now, this process can take up to 400 years, and it affects them from the inside out, starting with their bones. So there is little indication that the giant is slowly being petrified until the process is nearly complete. That said, while a typical desert giant weighs somewhere around 7,000 pounds, a giant who is nearing the end of their life can weigh double that amount on account of most of their innards and bones being turned into rock. As they approach the end, their eyes also change from a piercing blue to a deep brown. Once this change in eye color occurs, the giant is truly within its final days. This curse might not seem that brutal at first glance. I mean, sure, maybe it's shortening their lifespan, but 400 years is more than some other giants get, cursed or no. However, because they become petrified, this also means they never technically die, meaning that their soul is still trapped within the petrified remains of their body. Now, there are no specific rules for what I'm about to say. However, one has to wonder what happens to a petrified giant in the desert. Over time, their body, now turned to stone, will be eroded away until they just become one with the sands below, assuming their petrified body isn't destroyed or taken somewhere before that. When that happens, are they considered dead? As in, does their soul get released, or are they still trapped now within countless grains of sand? This is something the DM gets to ultimately decide. However, there is one thing that seems to suggest desert giants are indeed trapped within the stone they become. Among the giants, there are some who call themselves sand shifters. Sand shifters are the shamans and mystics of desert giant society, specifically because they possess the innate ability to summon the petrified remnants of their ancestors. They can temporarily breathe life into a petrified desert giant, allowing it to move and fight for a short period of time. They can also summon forth manifestations of petrified desert giants from the sand itself, even if there's no obvious giant stone body around, which to me implies that the spirits of these petrified desert giants still persist within the desert sands itself. Also, the idea of a giant forming from all the grains of sand to then start beating the shit out of the party sounds awesome. But that's unrelated. I do think this is a great bit of lore that we can do a ton of cool stuff with as a DM. However, before I get into that, we gotta talk about Realm of Bassalin. Have you ever had an awesome idea for a character in an RPG only to realize that your game of choice doesn't really have the options you need to make it work? Well, today's sponsor, Realm of Bassalin, has got you covered. Realm of Bassalin is a truly unique RPG where the goal is to streamline the rules into a fast and snappy game night with complete freedom during character creation, so you can make whatever you want, however you want. There are over 50 classes, 20 races, 200 spells, and 140 monsters, all designed to create as little friction as possible with the game you want to play. If that sounds cool to you and you want to check it out for yourself, use the link in the description down below and head on over to the Realm of Bassalin page on DriveThruRPG, where you can get yourself a copy of this game right now. You don't gotta wait even like 5 minutes, you can just get it now. So thank you to Realm of Bassalin for bringing us here this week to talk about cursed giants. Speaking of which, when updating these guys into 5e D&D, I wanted to do a couple of things. First and foremost, I wanted to create a basic stat block in line with the existing giants, but still something that felt unique. This was honestly tough, because the basic giant stat blocks in the 5e monster manual are all pretty basic. They're dudes, but big, and it's hard to iterate on that too much without accidentally making some kind of eldritch horror. I also needed to figure out a general power level for the desert giants, but thankfully, we do have some precedent. Giants in D&D tend to get larger the more dangerous they are, and desert giants fit squarely between the CR5 hill giants and the CR7 stone giants, so I assigned them a challenge rating of 6. For their attack options, they get 2 swings with either a scimitar or a spear carved from a tree. In desert giant lore, these spears are often viewed as family heirlooms, and they are one of the few things that distinguish them from the other giants in terms of weaponry. After all, there aren't many rocks to toss in the desert, so the desert giant has to come prepared. I also gave them a trait inspired by their original entry, which I called Fleet of Foot. This trait gives the desert giant immunity to difficult terrain and imposes disadvantage on opportunity attacks since they are so nimble, at least for a giant. Another weird little niche thing is that they are immune to lycanthropy, which is just so funny to me. I mean, most of the time lycanthropy only affects humanoid creatures, so not giants, but there are some rare cases of giant lycanthropy, and because these guys are already cursed by the petrification thing, they're immune to becoming werewolves or where anything else is. They can also speak Common, which is rare among the giant species, but as one of the few giants that regularly interacts with humanoid settlements, I figured that would make sense. Now on to our second stat block, the desert giant Sandshifter. This is my attempt to make a more powerful alternative for the desert giant that plays off of their shaman-like lore. Sandshifters are CR9, making them significantly more powerful. However, that extra power isn't reflected by an increase to their melee damage or stats, but their magical prowess. They swap out the scimitar for a stone staff that can knock people prone, and the spear attack with a storm bolt attack that causes lightning damage. They can also use spell casting to cast things like Pass Wall, Stone Shape, Stone Skin, Flesh to Stone, Melt into Stone, and Wall of Stone, providing them and their allies with some strategic options as well as some extra versatility while traveling the wasteland. Particularly, I like the idea that they are using Pass Wall to seamlessly bring their herd through mountains rather than go all the way around. Lastly, their big flagship ability is called Wake the Ancients. This ability allows them to summon 1d6 desert giants from the sand or stone to fight on their behalf for a full minute before they return to their petrified slumber. So if you ever see a desert giant wandering the wastes alone, just know there's a chance they are indeed not truly by themselves. As far as using a desert giant in your campaign, we've got so many great options here. One thing I didn't mention earlier on is that these giants regularly use mounts. Now, of course, as giants, they require giant mounts, so they will often ride on giant lizards or giant pack animals, whatever giant creatures happen to be around that they can manage to tame and ride. Most notably, some of them even manage to ride on rocks. And if you're not familiar with the Monster Manual, but you are familiar with SpongeBob, I get how this is confusing. Not those kind of rocks, ROC rocks. The giant birds, the super dangerous giant birds, which honestly sounds like an even more terrifying encounter than a rock normally is. I could also see some of these creatures learning to tame and ride sky rays, which are the sort of manta ray-like giant flying creatures, which I did a video on like forever ago. They're pretty cool. But regardless of their mount of choice, you can encounter these creatures in many different ways. Desert giants work regularly as mercenaries, though this usually happens if they lose their herd for some reason. Whether that's due to drought or simply unfortunate circumstance, a giant skilled with the blade is always going to be able to find work if they want it. A giant can also make for a great merchant encounter that might present a bit of an alternative flavor compared to most. Personally, I really like the idea of a desert giant clan that trades in horses rather than cattle. Perhaps this clan is said to raise the best horses in the region, and if the party manages to track them down and help them with some sort of quest, they might be able to get themselves a few war horses that can run extra fast or something. Whether they're doing it for horses, treasure, payment of some other kind, or just because it's the right thing to do, a group of desert giants dealing with a predator could also make for a great little side quest. Maybe the giant's herd is being thinned night after night, and despite their best efforts, they can never seem to find the culprit. The party might be able to help them track down whatever or whoever is taking the animals in the giant's herd and put a stop to it. It could be some kind of horrible monster like a silt horror, or maybe just a bunch of common thieves with a sophisticated abduction method, possibly using magic. And in either case, perhaps someone else is trying to use them as a tool to push the giants into a desperate situation to suit their own needs. Maybe a corrupt king in the nearby kingdom is hoping to recruit the giants as mercenaries, knowing they won't agree to do so unless they're on hard times. Or maybe this king is hoping to frame a rival kingdom or a troublesome settlement on his lands to use the giants as a tool to eradicate them while keeping his own hands clean. And if you want the giants to be the antagonists of this tale, perhaps they are decimating the local wildlife with the grazing of their herd, and the party has been sent by the powers that be to stop it. Whether they're getting this quest from a ruler who owns the land, a helpless community of villagers, or a druidic circle that wants to preserve nature, the end goal is the same. They need to get the giants to slow their roll and prevent an ecological disaster. The giants are unlikely to care about this at all, and maybe they won't accept payment to just leave for some reason. Or maybe the community whose food supply they plan to decimate can't afford to pay any kind of bribe. So the players will then need to either slay some giants, convince them to leave, or find some other way to help them out with some kind of problem in exchange for an arrangement where the giants frig off. I also really like the concept of a sand shifter guiding the party through a mountain or something using their at-will ability to cast Pass Wall. If the adventuring party is in dire need of passage, or even if it will just save them a few days of travel, this could be a really cool alternative route through the mountains, or even a stone wall. Perhaps the party needs to get access to a city that is walled off from the rest of the world, and for some reason or another, they can't use the main gate. There are tons of different ways they might attempt to breach the city's walls, but a desert giant with the ability to make a temporary hole in it is a pretty cool one. It's also worth mentioning that this petrification curse the giants carry could be a campaign in and of itself. I mean, maybe some of the desert giants are on a quest to try and find a cure for this curse. There might be some kind of ancient scriptures in a lost temple somewhere that can tell them how to break the curse, or perhaps they're maybe even forming an army to try and destroy the deity that cursed them to begin with. Honestly, this all reminds me of my favorite giant species, the death giants, who I made a video about forever ago, and they actually got an official 5e update in Big B Presents Glory of the Giants. And what a glow up too. They went from basically Nosferatu to cute goth girl with a wolf cut, well, except this guy, so I guess some of them are still Nosferatu adjacent, but I digress. Despite my feelings on the new Death Giant art, which is awesome, they completely obliterated everything cool about them by more or less reducing their story to they're cloud giants who live in the Shadowfell, which is tough. But their original lore had this whole thing about a generational curse on account of a pact made with a demonic entity that consumed their souls upon death, but they found a loophole to screw over the fiend that they made that bargain with, and then they mounted multiple crusades to try and find a way out. It's a whole thing, but as I said in that video, I will say again, a monster with a built-in adventuring hook like this, where there is some kind of huge looming problem in the background, is awesome. If it barely comes up at the table, it's just a cool bit of world building to make your game feel just a touch more lived in. And should the players latch onto it and decide they're gonna be the ones to fix this curse, we've got a whole new adventure on our hands. Anyways, as always, if you want to use this monster in your game or just look at its stats, a link in the description down below. There is a Google document which contains all the information you will need to successfully run this creature at your game table. And of course, if you're one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon, you can find the high-res PDF version of this monster, which contains the same game information, but is presented in a more fanciful way, as my way of saying thank you to the folks who throw me a few bucks each month and make this channel possible. If you're not already a patron, consider checking it out. It's $3 a month, you get some cool monster stats, and they look awesome, and they always feature the artwork prominently, which this week was done by the ever-talented Tam. I love the way that they draw giants. And speaking of patrons, thank you so much to this week's randomly selected patron of the week, Dreamy. I could never dream of having this much support, so thank you so much. And as always, thank you for watching. If there's a monster from an older edition of Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, some other role-playing game, a cool TV show, or video game you like, whatever, let me know in the not in the description, you can't change that. Let me know in the comments down below, or over the Dungeon Dad Discord, which is also linked in the description down below, and who knows, you might see it show up on a future episode of Monster of the Week. Something else I didn't really get super into in this episode is that these giants do also show up in Pathfinder. There's not a lot of meaningful changes made to their lore, other than the fact that they're vegetarian for some reason, but they got some cool artwork there, so that's neat. Shouts out to Pathfinder. Anyways, once again, thank you so much for watching. That's all I got for you this week, and I'll see you in the next one. Till then.